Conservatives developed a criticism of American society, starting in the 1980s and continuing in the 1990s. Robert Bork, who failed to win a Supreme Court seat in 1987, led the charge of conservatives against the decline of American society. In 1996, he wrote an angry attack on liberalism in Slouching Toward Gomorrah, Modern Liberalism and America's Decline. Conservative critics like Bork blamed violence and sex in television and films on liberals. The theme of the 1990s, stressed by conservatives, was moral rot. American society was on decline because of hedonism, sexuality, violence, homosexuality, feminism, and environmentalism promoted by liberals. Bork further argued that conservatives favored individualism and liberals radical equalitarianism. Other critics of the decline of American life were Allen Bloom in his 1987 Closing of the American Mind about the trivialization of American intellectual life, William Bennett in his 1992 Devaluing of America, and fellow conservative critic Lynn Cheney worried about the decline of educational standards and the lack of a common civic culture. James Wilson in Moral Sense in 1993 expressed similar concerns about the decline of American values. Cultural conservatives blamed liberalism, the Supreme Court decisions of the 1960s, and the baby boomers' lack of family values. David Blankenhorn, director of the Institute of American Values, wrote in 1993 of America's decline due to the disintegration of the American family. Again, the Christian Coalition emerged out of the 1988 campaign of Pat Robertson, and by mid-1992 had 150,000 members. It controlled the Republican Party in several southern states. This reflected the continuing attempt since the late 1970s of Christian conservatives, linked to evangelical Protestant leaders, to bring their values back into the political process. Christian Coalition played a primary role in the 1994 Republican victory winning control of Congress. Culture conservatives gained a following among white working-class Americans in the South in particular. Merging politics and cultural conservatism in the 1990s, the religious right campaigned against evolution, sex education, and for prayer in public schools. The divisions over values and the role of religion in public life continued through the 1990s and became embedded in the political process up to the 2016 presidential campaign. The cultural divisions in American society were summed up by Gertrude Himmelfarb in One Nation, Two Cultures in 1999. In 1988, Vice President George Bush defeated Senator Robert Dole of Kansas, former Secretary of State Alexander Haig, and TV evangelist Pat Robertson for the Republican presidential nomination. He selected Indiana Senator Dan Quayle as his running mate. Democrats selected Governor Michael Dukakis of Massachusetts as their candidate after Colorado Senator Gary Hart self-destructed in a sexual scandal. Dukakis, our first Greek-American presidential candidate, tapped Senator Lloyd Bentsen of Texas as his running mate. Dukakis failed to identify with the voters and ran a badly managed campaign. Bush stressed prosperity and law and order, using the famous Willie Horton advertisement to portray Dukakis as soft on crime. Bush easily won the election, carrying 49 million votes to 42 million for Dukakis, and winning 426 to 111 electoral votes. President Bush became the last president who served in World War II. Was this a realignment of American politics that started with the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980? Would the Republicans now dominate the White House? The Bush administration did not anticipate the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe in 1989, or the fall of the Berlin Wall. By 1991, communism collapsed in the Soviet Union, and the Cold War ended during the Bush administration, as communist regimes and communist parties collapsed throughout Europe. Mikhail Gorbachev, unlike previous Soviet leaders, refused to use force to keep communist regimes in power. He hoped to reform communism, but his efforts failed in the Soviet Union, leading to the collapse of the USSR and the emergence of Boris Yeltsin as leader of the Russian Federation. For the next decade, the United States appeared as the only remaining superpower. Members of the Bush administration hoped with the collapse of communism, a Pax Americana had arrived. With the Soviet Union disintegration into its constituent republics, each of which joined the United Nations, it appeared that a new world order had arrived, and the tensions of the Cold War era from 1945 to 1991 had evaporated. In 1991, as the USSR collapsed, the movement for arms control accelerated American efforts under President Bush, and later President Clinton failed to prevent arms proliferation as India and Pakistan became nuclear states. China increased its nuclear arsenal. North Korea and Iran began research into nuclear weapons development. With the end of the Cold War, the Bush administration reversed the military buildup of the Reagan administration and cut defense expenditures and the size of the military. On August 2, 1990, Iraq invaded Kuwait. From 1980 to 1988, the Reagan administration backed Iraq in the war with Iran, viewing the secular Hussein as the lesser of two evils. Hussein, however, wanted to dominate the oil markets by annexing Kuwait. President Bush shifted American policy and obtained a resolution from the United Nations ordering Iraq to withdraw from Kuwait. When Hussein refused, the United States sent 400,000 troops to the Middle East. President Bush organized a coalition of the French, British, Egyptians, Syrians, and Saudis, among others, to push back the Iraqis out of Kuwait. Most Democratic leaders preferred economic sanctions to force, but on January 15, 1991, the majority in both houses of Congress authorized the president to take military action if he felt it was necessary. The United States engaged in the Gulf War with the authorization of Congress and the United Nations. The military operations for Desert Storm began on February 23, 1991. The United States and its coalition allies pushed the Iraqis out of Kuwait, but stopped short of removing Hussein from power, and did not aid Shia or Kurds or other dissenters when they rose in rebellion unsuccessfully against Hussein. We fought the war for limited objectives, achieved them, and refused to become further engaged in the internal struggle against Hussein. Americans lost 148 killed and 467 wounded. The Bush approval rating soared to 87% in the wake of Desert Storm, and we appeared to roll back the Vietnam Syndrome. Under President Bush, the United States sent troops into Panama in December 1989 in Operation Just Cause to remove General Manuel Noriega from power and arrest him on drug charges. Noriega fled to the Vatican Embassy, but eventually he agreed to leave and be brought to the United States for trial. In April of 1992, he was convicted in the U.S. In 1991-92, as Yugoslavia splintered, the Bush administration took a hands-off policy of non-intervention, hoping our European allies would deal with the issue, but they failed to do so, creating the worst humanitarian disaster in Europe since the end of World War II. We did intervene in Somalia in 1992 to protect UN food deliveries, and initially it was a successful humanitarian intervention. But it fell apart under Bush's successor, President Bill Clinton, as warlords attacked American and Pakistani peacekeepers and humanitarian workers, forcing the humiliating withdrawal of American troops from Somalia.